Power corrupts, but absolute power in a small town breeds a dangerous kind of arrogance. Sheriff Mitchell Brody thought he owned Oak Creek. He believed he could frame a passing stranger just to close a frustrating case. He was dead wrong. She wasn't a drifter. She was federal law enforcement. Oak Creek, Georgia, was the kind of picturesque southern haven that looked beautiful on a postcard but hid rotting wood beneath its freshly painted facade. Lined with ancient weeping willows and charming brick storefronts, the town thrived on a carefully maintained illusion of safety and order. At the center of this illusion was Sheriff Mitchell Brody. For 14 years, Brody had worn his silver star less like a badge of public service and more like a crown. He was the judge, jury, and, when it suited his political ambitions or his wallet, the executioner. He had built a career on intimidation, targeting those who lacked the resources to fight back. He had railroaded local mechanics like Arthur Penhaligon over fabricated zoning violations just to seize property, and he regularly harassed anyone passing through who didn't fit his narrow, prejudiced view of what an Oak Creek resident should look like. On a sweltering Tuesday afternoon, Harper Davis walked into Elegance and Grace, the town's premier high-end boutique and antique jewelry store. Harper was a striking black woman in her late 30s, dressed impeccably in a tailored beige linen suit that spoke of quiet wealth and refined taste. She moved with a calm, deliberate grace, her eyes scanning the glass display cases with the practiced observation of someone who noticed absolutely everything. She wasn't a local, and in a town like Oak Creek, being an unfamiliar face was enough to draw stares. Being a successful, confident black woman, examining a 5-figure diamond collection, was enough to draw a target on her back. Madeline Hayes, the store owner, greeted Harper with a tight, nervous smile. Madeline was a fragile woman who had spent years bending to the will of Oak Creek's power players, terrified of stepping out of line. She unlocked the heavy glass case to show Harper a vintage 1920s emerald tennis bracelet. Harper examined the piece, her expression neutral, completely unaware, or so it seemed, that a shadow had just darkened the store's doorway. Sheriff Brody strolled in, the heavy leather of his gun belt creaking in the quiet shop. He was a large, imposing man with a permanent scowl etched into his flushed face, his mirrored sunglasses pushed up onto his receding hairline. He had been having a bad month. A string of high-end burglaries had struck the wealthy neighborhoods of Oak Creek, and the affluent residents were threatening to back his opponent in the upcoming election. Brody desperately needed an arrest. He needed a scapegoat, and as his eyes landed on Harper, his predatory instincts flared. She was a stranger. She was an outsider. In his twisted mind, she was the perfect suspect. "Afternoon, Madeline," Brody drawled, his voice booming unpleasantly in the refined space. He didn't take his eyes off Harper. "Everything secure in here today?" "Oh yes, Sheriff. Just showing this lovely lady some of our vintage collection," Madeline stammered, her hands trembling slightly as she placed a velvet tray on the glass counter. Brody stepped closer, invading Harper's personal space. He looked her up and down, a smirk playing on his lips. "Passing through?" he asked, the question sounding more like a demand. Harper placed the emerald bracelet gently back onto the velvet tray. She turned her head, meeting Brody's gaze with a pair of piercing, unflinching brown eyes. "I am," she replied, her voice smooth and completely devoid of the intimidation Brody was so used to hearing. "Just taking in the local sights." "Right," Brody scoffed. "We get a lot of tourists lately. Strange how things start going missing right around the time unfamiliar folks decide to take in the sights." Harper didn't take the bait. She simply nodded politely and turned back to the counter. "It's a beautiful piece, Madeline, but not quite what I'm looking for. I'll be on my way." As Harper reached into her designer handbag to retrieve her sunglasses, Brody made his move. It was a sleight of hand he had perfected over years of planting evidence on unsuspecting teenagers and transient workers. While Madeline was distracted by Harper turning away, Brody's thick fingers brushed against the velvet tray. In a fraction of a second, a $15,000 diamond and sapphire pendant vanished from the display and slipped into the deep pocket of his uniform trousers. "Hold on a second there," Brody barked, his voice suddenly hard and authoritative. He pointed a thick, accusing finger at the display case. "Madeline, wasn't there a sapphire piece right there?" Next to the emeralds? Madeline gasped, her eyes widening as she stared at the empty indentation on the velvet tray. I think so. Yes. The Duchess pendant. It was just there. Panic seized her, exactly as Brody had anticipated. Brody took a step back, his hand dropping to rest menacingly on the butt of his service weapon. "Nobody moves," he commanded, loud enough for the pedestrians outside to hear. He turned his full, wrathful attention to Harper. "You. Hands where I can see them." Right now. Harper froze, her hands hovering above her open purse. Her face revealed no panic, no fear, only a cold, calculated stillness. "Sheriff, I highly suggest you review the store's security cameras before you make an accusation you cannot take back," she said, her tone dangerously calm. "I don't need a camera to tell me what I just saw," Brody sneered, stepping forward and aggressively grabbing Harper by the arm. "You come into my town. You think you can pull a fast one because Madeline here is too polite to watch you like a hawk? You picked the wrong town, sweetheart." He practically dragged her toward the center of the store, ignoring Madeline's frantic, confused pleas. Within seconds, a crowd began to gather outside the large glass windows. Brody loved an audience. It was an election year, and an arrest made in broad daylight, catching a thief red-handed, was exactly the kind of press he needed. He violently wrenched Harper's hands behind her back, the cold steel of the handcuffs biting into her wrists. "You are making a monumental mistake," Harper stated, her voice steady, though her eyes were now burning with an intense, focused anger. She offered no physical resistance, a fact that seemed to disappoint Brody. "The only mistake made today was you stepping foot in Oak Creek," Brody replied, leaning in close so she could smell the stale coffee and chewing tobacco on his breath. "You're under arrest for grand larceny. Let's see how much you like our local accommodations." He marched her out of the store, parading her past the whispering, pointing locals. Harper walked with her head held high, memorizing the faces, the layout of the street, and the exact sequence of events. Brody thought he had just secured his re-election. He had no idea he had just detonated a bomb under his entire corrupt empire. The Oak Creek Sheriff's Department was a relic of the past, housed in a dilapidated brick building that smelled strongly of industrial bleach and old sweat. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered incessantly, casting a sickly yellow glow over the scuffed linoleum floors. Brody practically shoved Harper through the double doors, a triumphant grin plastered across his face. He paraded her past the dispatch desk, ignoring the wide-eyed stare of Deputy Winston, a young, newly minted officer who still believed in the law he was sworn to uphold. "Got ourselves a live one, Winston," Brody called out, roughly guiding Harper toward the holding cells at the back. Caught her red-handed at elegance and grace. Tried to walk out with 15 grand worth of ice. Winston stood up, looking nervously between the imposing sheriff and the impeccably dressed, handcuffed woman. "Sheriff, should I start the booking process? Read her rights? I already took care of it," Brody lied smoothly, a blatant civil rights violation that Harper immediately cataloged in her mind. "Put her in interrogation room 2. I'm going to have a little chat with our guest before we process her belongings." Winston gingerly took Harper by the arm, clearly uncomfortable with the excessive force Brody was using. As he led her into the cramped, windowless interrogation room, Harper looked at him. "Deputy," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet authority, "I strongly recommend you document the exact time I was brought in, and note that I have not been read my Miranda warnings. For your own sake." Winston swallowed hard, his face paling slightly. He sat her down in the metal chair bolted to the floor and quickly exited, locking the heavy steel door behind him. Left alone, Harper did not weep. She did not panic. She sat perfectly still, stretching her shoulders against the uncomfortable constraints of the handcuffs. She was waiting. 10 minutes later, the door slammed open, and Brody strutted in, carrying a manila folder and a tape recorder. He slammed the recorder onto the metal table and hit the red button. He pulled out a chair, flipped it around, and straddled it, trying to loom over her. "All right, let's make this easy on both of us," Brody began, his tone dripping with false benevolence. You tell me where you fenced the rest of the jewelry from the Oak Heights burglaries. You sign a confession for the pendant today, and maybe I talk to the DA about leniency. You play hardball, and I promise you, you will rot in a state penitentiary for the next 20 years. Harper stared at him, her expression a mask of pure ice. I have not been read my rights. I have not been permitted a phone call. You arrested me without probable cause, and you are currently attempting to coerce a confession for crimes I have zero connection to. You are out of your depth, Mitchell. Brody's face darkened, a vein throbbing at his temple. You don't get to tell me the law in my town, lady, and you sure as hell don't call me by my first name. He slammed his fist on the table, the loud crack echoing in the small room. I know your kind. You think because you're dressed nice you can talk down to me. I've broken tougher people than you before lunch. I don't doubt that you have broken people, Harper replied smoothly, leaning forward slightly. You broke Arthur Penhaligon when you forged zoning documents to seize his garage. You broke the Miller family when you intimidated them into dropping assault charges against your brother-in-law. You've broken a lot of things, Mitchell, but you will not break me, for a fraction of a second. True panic flashed across Brody's eyes. How could this random tourist possibly know about Arthur Penhaligon? Those records were buried. That was a local, tightly kept secret. He quickly masked his shock with a sneer. You talk too much nonsense. Let's see who you really are. Brody had Harper's designer handbag sitting on the counter outside. He realized, with a jolt of frustration, that in his eagerness to parade her through town, he hadn't actually searched her bag. He stormed to the door, yanking it open. Winston, bring me the suspect's bag. Winston appeared a moment later, carrying the leather handbag. He looked pale, his hands shaking noticeably. Sheriff, I started the inventory log, like the manual says. I didn't ask you to do that, you idiot. Brody snatched the bag from the young deputy. He walked back to the metal table and unceremoniously dumped the contents onto the surface. Out tumbled a sleek wallet, a set of keys, some high-end cosmetics, and a small, heavy leather case. Brody scoffed. Tossing the cosmetics aside, he picked up the wallet first, flipping it open to find her driver's license. Harper Davis, he read aloud, a nasty grin forming. Well, Harper Davis from Washington, D.C. You are a long way from home. He tossed the wallet down and picked up the heavy leather case. It was secured with a sturdy snap. Let's see what you're trying to hide in here. Drugs? Stolen cash? He unsnapped the case and flipped it open. The room suddenly went deathly silent. The tape recorder continued its quiet, rhythmic hiss, the only sound in the suffocating space. Brody stared at the object in his hand, his breath caught in his throat. The color rapidly drained from his flushed face, leaving him looking sickly and gray. His hands, previously strong and aggressive, began to tremble so violently that the leather case almost slipped from his grasp. Gleaming under the harsh, flickering fluorescent light was a solid gold shield, topped with an eagle. Next to it was an identification card. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Special Agent Harper Davis. Office of Professional Responsibility. Public Corruption Unit. Brody couldn't breathe. The air had been sucked out of the room. He looked from the badge to the woman sitting handcuffed across from him. The arrogant sneer was entirely gone, replaced by the hollow, terrified stare of a man who realized he had just stepped off a cliff. Harper didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply leaned back in her chair, the cold steel of the cuffs clinking against the metal. As I was saying, Mitchell, Harper said, her voice dropping to a low, authoritative register that commanded absolute obedience. You are severely out of your depth. Now, take these cuffs off me. You are sitting in my chair. The heavy silence in the interrogation room stretched until it felt thick enough to choke on. Sheriff Mitchell Brody stared at the gold FBI shield, his mind violently rejecting the reality resting in his trembling hand. This was a nightmare. It had to be a nightmare. A woman he had profiled, humiliated, and framed in broad daylight was a federal agent operating within the elite public corruption unit. Take them off. Special Agent Harper Davis repeated. her voice cutting through the stale air like a physical blade. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The sheer weight of her authority was absolute. Brody fumbled for his keys, his thick fingers slipping clumsily. He walked behind her, his breathing ragged and shallow, and unlocked the cuffs. The heavy metal brackets fell to the floor with a sharp clang. Harper calmly rubbed her wrists, stood up, and smoothed the wrinkles from her linen suit. She stepped around the metal table and reclaimed her leather credential case from Brody's paralyzed grasp. You didn't say anything," Brody stammered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched wheeze. The booming, arrogant southern drawl was entirely gone. "Why didn't you identify yourself?" "Because if I had, Mitchell, you wouldn't have shown me who you really are," Harper replied, walking toward the heavy steel door. "Though, to be perfectly clear, I didn't wander into Oak Creek by accident. We have been watching you for 11 months. Brody staggered backward, hitting the cinder block wall. "Watching me? Did you honestly believe a string of high-end burglaries targeting only the wealthiest estates in the county wouldn't trigger federal oversight? Especially when the stolen goods were crossing state lines to a pawn shop in South Carolina?" Harper turned to face him, her eyes locking onto his with predatory intensity. "A pawn shop registered to a shell company, which is owned by your brother-in-law. A shell company that U.S. Attorney David Estes of the Southern District of Georgia has spent the last month quietly dismantling. The mention of David Estes, a notoriously ruthless federal prosecutor, known for tearing apart corrupt law enforcement networks across the South, made Brody's knees buckle. He slid down the wall slightly, his ruddy complexion turning a sickly, translucent white. "You thought you were framing a random tourist to close your cases and secure an election," Harper continued, her tone clinical and merciless. "In reality, the Oak Heights burglaries were committed by 2 of your own night shift deputies, acting on your direct orders. You used your badge to run a criminal syndicate, terrorizing the citizens you swore an oath to protect. Extortion, wire fraud, Hobbs Act violations, deprivation of rights under color of law. And now, grand larceny and the false imprisonment of a federal agent." Harper reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek encrypted smartphone. She tapped a single button and held it to her ear. "Davis here. Operation is a go." The target took the bait and escalated to grand larceny and false arrest. "Execute the warrants. All of them." She ended the call and slipped the phone away. "Within the next 90 seconds, Mitchell, this building is going to be swarming with federal agents. If you attempt to run, if you attempt to reach for your service weapon, or if you do anything other than place your hands flat on that metal table, this situation will end very poorly for you." Brody was a man who had survived entirely on the fear of others, confronted with someone who feared him not at all. Someone who held the full, crushing weight of the United States Department of Justice in the palm of her hand. He completely shattered. He stumbled forward and collapsed into the metal chair, burying his face in his hands. He began to weep, a pathetic, ugly sound that echoed off the concrete walls. The quiet of the precinct was suddenly shattered. Outside the interrogation room, the sound of heavy boots slamming against the linoleum floor reverberated through the building. Men and women in tactical gear bearing the bold yellow letters FBI swarmed the dispatch area. Deputy Winston's panicked voice could be heard shouting, "Whoa! Hey! What is this? We're local law enforcement." The interrogation room door swung violently open. 2 heavily armed agents stepped inside, their rifles at the low ready, scanning the room before their eyes settled on Harper. "Agent Davis, are you injured?" the lead agent asked, keeping a wary eye on the sobbing sheriff. "I'm perfectly fine, Agent Miller." "Secure the suspect," Harper ordered. Miller stepped forward, grabbing Brody by his uniform collar and hauling him to his feet. "Mitchell Brody, you are under arrest for federal racketeering, extortion, and civil rights violations. You have the right to remain silent." As the Miranda rights were finally read in that room this time, legitimately Harper walked out. She found Deputy Winston standing by the dispatch desk, his hands raised in the air, surrounded by federal agents securing the filing cabinets and computer servers. Winston looked terrified, his eyes darting wildly until they landed on Harper. "You," Winston breathed, staring at her badge. "You can lower your hands, Deputy," Harper said gently, the icy demeanor melting into a professional, empathetic calm. "You aren't the target of this investigation. In fact, your adherence to the manual today, despite your boss's orders, is going to save your career. I need you to direct my team to the evidence locker, and then I need you to hand over the inventory log you started for my personal effects." Winston nodded frantically, his relief palpable. "Yes, ma'am." "Right away, Special Agent." The fall of Oak Creek's tyrant was not a quiet affair. It was a spectacular, very public implosion that rocked the town to its core. Within an hour of Brody's arrest at the precinct, a convoy of black SUVs descended upon elegance and grace. Madeline Hayes was still standing behind her counter, clutching a tissue and trying to calm her racing heart, convinced she was going to be blamed for the missing Duchess pendant. When the door chimed and Harper walked back in, this time flanked by 2 federal agents in suits, Madeline nearly fainted. "Madeline," Harper said warmly, stepping forward. "Please, take a deep breath. You are safe. Sheriff Brody is currently in federal custody." Madeline gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "In custody? But you." "I'm Special Agent Harper Davis with the FBI," Harper explained, presenting her credentials. "The sheriff planted that pendant in his own pocket to manufacture a reason to arrest me. My agents have already recovered the piece from his trousers during his booking process. It will be returned to you once it is photographed for evidence." Madeline burst into tears of overwhelming relief. He's really gone? He's been threatening to shut down my store for years unless I paid him an unofficial security fee. I was so scared." "You don't ever have to be scared of Mitchell Brody again," Harper assured her, placing a comforting hand on the woman's shoulder. "My team is going to need a full statement regarding those extortion payments. Every detail will help ensure he never sees the outside of a cell." While Harper secured Madeline's testimony, the FBI executed a simultaneous raid on Brody's sprawling 10-acre property on the outskirts of town. The property, bought on a public servant's salary, had long been a source of whispered speculation. The truth was worse than anyone imagined. Hidden inside a climate-controlled barn behind the main house, agents uncovered a staggering hoard. There were rows of stolen riding mowers, ATVs, and high-end electronics. They found a floor safe buried under bags of feed containing over $250,000 in banded cash, illegal narcotics confiscated from evidence but never logged, and most damning of all, a series of handwritten ledgers. Brody was arrogant enough to keep meticulous records of his bribes, his illegal seizures, and the names of every local business owner he was bleeding dry. The hard karma hit the town of Oak Creek like a cleansing thunderstorm. As news broke, the fear that had kept the town silent shattered. People began flooding the federal hotline set up at the local community center. Arthur Penhaligon, the mechanic who had his garage stolen through forged zoning violations, brought in his original deeds and emails proving Brody had fabricated the entire dispute. The Miller family came forward to testify about the violent intimidation tactics Brody used to protect his family members from assault charges. The 2 night shift deputies who had been carrying out the Oak Heights burglaries turned state's evidence within 48 hours, providing explicit, recorded audio of Brody ordering the break-ins and dictating which houses to hit. The federal indictment was a masterpiece of legal destruction, heavily championed by U.S. Attorney David Estes. Brody faced 42 separate federal charges. The evidence was so overwhelming, the audio recording so damning, and the paper trail so meticulously documented in his own handwriting, that Brody's high-priced defense attorney advised him to take a plea deal before the trial even began. 9 months later, Harper Davis sat in the back row of a federal courtroom in Savannah, Georgia. She wore a sharp charcoal suit, her demeanor as calm and observant as the day she walked into the jewelry store. Mitchell Brody stood before the judge, stripped of his uniform, his silver star, and his arrogant swagger. He was dressed in a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, his hands shackled to his waist. He looked 20 years older, his hair thinned, his posture slumped into a permanent cringe. The judge, a stern woman with zero tolerance for public corruption, looked down at Brody with unconcealed disgust. "Mitchell Brody, you took an oath to protect the vulnerable. Instead, you weaponized the law, transforming yourself into a parasite, feeding on the very community you were sworn to serve. You are a disgrace to the badge. The gavel fell with a loud final crack. Brody was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, without the possibility of parole. As the marshals led Brody away, he turned his head, his eyes scanning the gallery until they landed on Harper. For a brief second, they locked eyes. There was no defiance left in him. Only the hollow, terrified realization that he had brought this entirely upon himself. He had picked the wrong woman on the wrong day, and it had cost him everything. Harper watched him disappear through the heavy wooden doors. She stood up, straightened her jacket, and walked out into the bright Georgia sunshine. Oak Creek was still a picturesque southern town, but the rot beneath the floorboards had been ripped out and exposed to the light. The illusion was gone, replaced by something much harder to build, but vastly more beautiful. Genuine, hard-won. Justice. When those who are sworn to protect become the predators, justice always finds a way to balance the scales. Sheriff Brody thought he was above the law, until the law walked right into his trap. If you loved this story of instant karma and ultimate justice, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more unbelievable real-life drama.